Good evening. Welcome to the Henry George School for the third session of our Masters of Money series. Tonight's session will be dedicated to the work of Satoshi Nakamoto, and our instructor is Dr. Walter Perry. Dr. Perry has long been engaged in developing the tools of semantic analysis to help better understand determinism, causality, and the emergence of new properties from a variety of data sources. Dr. Perry has offered many courses at the Henry George School, and his lectures are available at the school's YouTube channel. Dr. Perry, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ibrahim. All right. The beauty of this is that by discussing Satoshi and Satoshi's place in modern understanding of money and finance, I'm able to do a great deal of discussion about the trends of the last 50 years. So let's dive right in. That's assuming. There we go. Okay. Satoshi's published work is simply the 2008 white paper, Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic payment system. It is one of the most dense and information-packed papers that I or probably anyone have ever read. It's only 9 pages, and that includes the references. But in those 9 pages, it manages to cover an astonishing amount of philosophy, finance, economics, cryptography, and the theory of value, which is really the subject of tonight's talk. Besides the 2008 white paper, it's possible to follow Satoshi through the chat and through email correspondence during the period that he was launching the Bitcoin mainnet. And then there's the code itself. Satoshi left the project entirely in 2011 and has only been heard from once since then. But in the intervening years, while his original code base, which was 20,000 lines of astonishingly literate C++, has expanded to 750,000 lines of code in Bitcoin Core. And while none of the original Satoshi code is still running, it is possible to go back and examine the archaeology of the code and the few rather pithy comments that are to be found in there. The man is an astonishing wit, and to display that sort of wit inlined in executable code is quite remarkable. I can't think of anyone else in the production of software who's managed to do something similar, though, of course, in music and literature, that's truly the mark of a genius. Anyway, what Satoshi's real subject is reification and transfer of value. Those are terms that I've been using for more than 20 years now, but they're not terms that are in the mainstream. So probably the best way to approach Satoshi is to begin with understanding what these 3 terms mean: reification, transfer, and value. Let's start with value, because the work of Satoshi forces us to reconsider 2.5 centuries of what was considered value and the measure of value. For the past 60 years, the term value in economics, finance has been associated with the school of value investing. And the school of value investing traces its beginnings to Benjamin Graham, a professor at the Columbia Business School, who characterized his theory on the notion of margin of safety. That is, in analyzing an asset, a potential investment, you should not be looking for the potential of growth or growth in the price of the asset in the financial markets, so much as you should be looking to assure yourself a margin of safety. If you're buying a bond, you should look to see that the revenues of the company which issued the bond cover several times over the principal and interest expense of repaying the bond. Even better if it's a mortgage bond, which has collateral as a second level of security. The point being that you are looking to be certain that what you are buying is worth at least what you pay for it in terms of reified value, and ideally what you pay for it plus a considerable margin of safety. Now, Graham's most celebrated student is, of course, Warren Buffett, famously the only student to whom Graham ever gave an A+. And Warren Buffett has famously characterized value investing as you want to buy $1 worth of assets for 50 cents. And there are a number of ways you can do that. The most obvious way is to pay less than the liquidation value of the company whose securities you're buying, and pay less even than the discounted present value of those assets. This, of course, is vulture investing at its finest. Buffett, in his earlier days, characterized that as finding a cigar butt in the street with one puff left in it. And you enjoy the puff, you don't expect to have any further use for the cigar, but you've bought something for less than its intrinsic value. The other way to buy $1 of assets for 50 cents is to buy the certainty, or as near as you can come to the certainty, of a continuing stream of revenue from your investment. That is, if you can show that the coverage of the revenues, if you're talking about a bond, or the coverage of the earnings of the company are so secure that you can confidently pay less than the discounted value of what you will certainly get in a future stream of revenue, then you are effectively buying $1 of assets for 50 cents. In his early days, Buffett tended to prefer buying lousy companies where the discount was more significant. That is, companies which were literally the cigar butt with one good puff left in it that he found lying in the street. But over time, and particularly under the influence of Charlie Munger, he began to concentrate more and more on the quality of the company as illustrated by the quality of earnings. Now, Charlie Munger started out in his relationship with Buffett as Buffett's lawyer. Charlie founded the firm of Munger, Tullis, and Olson, generally ranked right at the top of the white shoe law firms. But by the mid 60s, he was working in partnership with Buffett, and for uh, the, the years in which Berkshire Hathaway, Buffett's investment vehicle, was the home and the citadel of value investing, Charlie was the number two man. Charlie died earlier this year, a month short of his 100th birthday. And I think Buffett's tribute to him after his death was exactly right, that Charlie was the architect of not just Berkshire Hathaway, but of value investing as opposed to growth investing as a school of investing philosophy. Uh, Buffett said in his letter memorializing Charlie Munger that we remember the guy who designed the building, the architect. We don't remember the guy who poured the concrete. And in our business, Charlie was the architect. And I think that's a proper way to understand it. Under the influence of Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett and Warren Buffett's investing philosophy, his value investing philosophy, came to concentrate on research to determine the quality of earnings and therefore the sustainability of earnings, which allowed him to buy into companies where he could exercise, as he said, his favorite holding period, which was forever. But the problem, the $280 billion question, has arisen in the past 3 years. At the moment, Berkshire Hathaway holds $280 billion in cash on its balance sheet because it can't find any $1 assets to buy for 50 cents. And that represents a sea change, an epochal change in the markets. It is a change that will, in my opinion, and I believe I'm going to demonstrate in Satoshi's opinion, make the sort of value investing which Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger practiced for the past 50 years essentially obsolete. There are three reasons that we might ascribe to that. One is that the markets are enjoying an enormous allocation of credit. That is, they are enjoying a significant percentage, one might argue a percentage greater than they're entitled to, of the wealth of not just the US, but in a globalized world, the wealth of humanity moving into financial assets, that is, credit being allocated to markets, which of course drives up the prices of the securities in those markets to the detriment of other uses of that money. But from a strictly value investing point of view, it means that there are not a lot of $1 assets out there that can be bought for 50 cents. This clearly troubled Charlie Munger very much in the last 2 years of his life, and he was constantly being asked, what are you going to do with the cash? And the answer was, we're not going to do anything that we don't understand. We're not going to put the cash anywhere except in value investing where we are confident we're buying $1 worth of assets for 50 cents. But the fact that the cash increased, and by the time of Charlie's death was $280 billion, raises the question not only of where are those assets going to be found, but whether they will ever again be found. Now, let's turn to a different view of what is value, which is reified in a very different way by Satoshi. What is Bitcoin? Well, we can begin by saying it is reified value, like the liquidation value of a value investment that Warren Buffett or Charlie Munger would buy. Bitcoin reifies a value in a coin. That's a crucial notion because the misunderstandings of Satoshi, which are legion, and the misunderstandings of Bitcoin, which are legion to an exponential degree, all come from a failure to understand what is reified value and what is abstract value, what is inherent value and what is speculative value. But as a starting point, we can say that Bitcoin is value reified as a coin. And the function of Bitcoin as a network, as a as a set of software processes, is to transfer that value, directly, peer-to-peer, without any third-party intermediation. The problem with the transfer of value has always been that it required a referee or a guarantor or a governor of the transfer process to certify that the thing being transferred was of the value that the parties expected, that it was legitimately the property of the transferring party, and when the transfer was completed, it was now provably and legitimately the property of the receiving party. If you disintermediate that authority, that whether it's a security and that's the issuer of the security, or it's a currency and that's the issuer of the currency, if you disintermediate that authority, the most disintermediated transfer of value you can achieve involves three entities. There's the transferring party, there's the receiving party, and there's the asset itself. It is not possible to disintermediate any of those three entities from the transfer, but the purpose of Bitcoin as a network and as operating software is to provide the mechanism for the peer-to-peer transfer of value, which does in fact disintermediate any parties other than those three. The way that Bitcoin reifies its value is by reifying the provenance of that value. Again, we're delving deep into not just philosophical terms, but philosophical understandings here, which people are not used to thinking of in the financial markets. But it is crucial to think of it this way. The value of Bitcoin depends on the chain of provenance which each Bitcoin or fraction of a Bitcoin, each reified unit of value being transferred, exhibits to both its transferor, its receiver, and most especially to anyone who cares to audit the transaction, which is visible to everyone. And the reified value is the chain of provenance that shows that the value has been trusted and accepted in passing from transferer to receiver over dozens or hundreds or thousands of transactions. The value of the Bitcoin is the cumulative credence of those who have accepted it and have relied on its mechanism of transfer in order to first receive value and then to receive value in exchange for the value represented in a particular Bitcoin. On the second page of the Bitcoin white paper, Satoshi begins his explanation by saying we define an electronic coin as a chain of digital signatures. That is the specific mechanism for the reification of the provenance of this. Now, those of you who've been good enough and patient enough to listen to my previous Henry George School lectures, and particularly the ones last year on John Law and Richard Cantillon, will know that I began with the proposition that identity is a verb, not a noun. And from that proposition onward, I am at odds with almost everyone else in finance, economics, law, computer science, what you will. But what we are saying is that the identity of this electronic coin is the series of transactions, the provenance, the actions of a verb and a series of verbs which give it its value. It is not a Bitcoin ontologically, it is a Bitcoin etiologically. It is not a Bitcoin because it corresponds to the schema that defines a Bitcoin as a noun. It is a Bitcoin because it exhibits the etiology which defines a Bitcoin as a verb. That is the chain of transactions, which is the unique history of that particular unit of reified value. All right, it is a bearer instrument. And given that it is the first bearer instrument to be devised in more than 250 years, it's worth examining what this means. And one of the analogies that easily comes to hand is the notion of a land deed. Now, there's been deed recording in the common law world since the Norman Conquest. The most important piece of governance and structure of governance imposed by William the Conqueror after the conquest was the compilation of the Doomsday Book, which took 20 years from 1066 to 1086. But it set down in a single authoritative record all of the recognized land holdings in the land he had conquered in England as he found it at the time of the conquest. However, even after the Doomsday Book and the practice of recording land deeds and the transfer of land deeds through the 19th century, essentially 800 years, 850 years from the time of the conquest, deeds did not have to be recorded to be valid. An unrecorded deed carried the provenance of the property it symbolized in itself. It is a particular form of bearer instrument. Deeds would routinely go generations without being recorded in England and in parts of America. But the actual stack of paper which constituted a deed might accumulate dozens and dozens and dozens of contracts, transfers, modifications over the years. So that, like a Bitcoin, that stack of paper, which was the deed, was the reification of its own provenance. Now, another analogy that I like even better, but which most people find a bridge too far, even though I'm very comfortable with using this as a basis for designing and implementing software, is to say that as a bearer instrument, Bitcoin is even more analogous to DNA. A SNP, a sequence of DNA, which encodes a particular single nucleotide, is not a noun. It's a verb. It doesn't encode a structure. It encodes a formula for the production of that thing. It reifies a verb. Its identity can only be understood as a verb, and that's true of Bitcoin. Even if you don't want to think about it in the world of genomics, we will think about it in the world of what is value, how is value transferred, how is value assured, validated, if you will, not just by the parties to the transaction, but by any external witness to that transaction. By reifying identity as a process, as a verb, every Bitcoin carries with it not only the value which that chain of transactions has reified in that Bitcoin, but it carries with it intrinsically all that is necessary to transfer that value to another party. Okay, now let's talk about the blockchain delusion. It has become fashionable in the last 10 years to say that Bitcoin might be an interesting experiment, but that the real technology here, the real value here is the blockchain. That is utter nonsense. In the 2008 white paper, the canonical source for what is Bitcoin and how does it operate, Satoshi never mentions blockchain. A blockchain, as we've come to know it, is simply a convenient data structure. It's a single linked list. That is, it is a string of components which are linked in a single direction. While the link itself can be used bidirectionally, the progress of the chain goes in one direction only. This misunderstanding goes back to the first attempt to redo Bitcoin from scratch and to improve on it. That was Ethereum, as created by Vitalik Buterin. And I'm just going to have to be ageist here. In his 17-year-old wisdom, Vitalik did not understand reification. He did not understand the necessity for value to be quite literally realized within the thing itself. His approach was everyone understands book entry ownership. Everyone understands account balance transfer in the world of bookkeeping and accounting. We don't need this reification of value. We will simply maintain an authoritative ledger. The problem, of course, is that the ledger is an abstraction. It helps us to look at Ethereum and to look at Vitalik's work and understand all the better why Bitcoin is something vastly different from the blockchain, as that phrase is now used, because Ethereum, which Vitalik created, and its progeny, a number in the tens of thousands as coins and projects and software and blockchains, but they are all abstractions of the thing rather than the thing itself. They model transfer, whereas Bitcoin implements transfer, and there's no bridging the two. Actually, Vitalik himself came to understand this about 3 years into the Ethereum project when he gave us the non-fungible token, which was an attempt to create a unit of reified value, but if it is reified, it has to be reified all the way down. The chain of provenance, which defines a Bitcoin, you can't build reified value on top of an abstract ledger. The notion that this is a distributed ledger and the delusion which follows from the blockchain delusion in most of these discussions that would impugn the validity of the Bitcoin mechanism, talk about distributed ledger technology. First of all, a ledger is by its nature an abstraction. Bitcoin is by its nature a reification of value. And abstraction cannot implement reification. And of course, the notion that the Ethereum ledger or any of the abstract ledgers that descend from the concepts behind Ethereum is distributed is nonsense. The fact that there exist X thousands copies of the same ledger may in fact mean that you can't kill it, that you can't shut down every single one of those copies, that because they are widely distributed, there will continue to be some copy somewhere which maintains the canonical ledger. That is still not distributed. A distributed ledger is one which is unique to the environment in which it is found. The relationship of genome to epigenome, to go back to the DNA example, but we won't dwell on that at great length. In any case, when you hear someone talk about blockchain technology, and particularly if you hear someone praising blockchain technology or distributed ledger technology it is a certainty that person knows nothing of the work of Satoshi Nakamoto. Bitcoin is based on what is known as the UTXO, that is the unspent transaction output. That is the actual reification of value. And the beauty of the UTXO is that it reifies the transaction as the output of that transaction. If we go right back to Satoshi's original definition, the coin is the collection of digital signatures. The coin is the reification of its provenance. The UTXO is the current, final, thus far, state of a particular reified value. It is that which has emerged from the most recent transaction, but which has not yet been consumed by a subsequent transaction. It is the unspent transaction output. The UTXOs reify the transaction, but what is the transaction? The transaction is the transformation of inputs to outputs. So by reifying the transaction in the UTXOs, which are its product, and its product not yet consumed by downstream transactions, its unspent product, we reify a verb within this apparent noun of the UTXO. That is, we reify within the UTXO the process which transformed given inputs, and those inputs are available for everyone to see, into the outputs which are available for everyone to see. That's why everyone can be confident that a UTXO is in fact unspent, because there is no transaction which has yet been reified in a further downstream UTXO, which begins by consuming the UTXO we are now looking at. If there were such a transaction, that UTXO would not exist. It would have been consumed. That is the proof of value, the proof of reification, which the chain of provenance guarantees. The blockchain is simply a convenient data structure, but the validating nodes of the Bitcoin network, that is, the nodes which receive the broadcast every time a new block is found, a new block is mined, those nodes do three things. They examine every transaction in the block to see that the inputs to that transaction were in fact UTXOs at the time that they were input to the transaction. Having done that and satisfied itself, each of these nodes, each of these roughly 19,000 nodes at the moment, adds to the chain of provenance, the chain of signatures, its own witness to the proper execution of each transaction in the newly found, newly mined block. It then updates its own distributed copy of the UTXO set. That is, it removes from its copy of the UTXO set all of the UTXOs, which it has seen consumed by transactions in the block, which it has just examined. And it adds to its UTXO set all of the UTXOs which are output by transactions in the block, which it has just examined. And then as a final thing, it consents, it validates the appending of the block it has validated, it has examined, onto the chain of Bitcoin blocks, onto the data structure that, though Satoshi did not call it that, we now refer to as a blockchain. But again, that blockchain is simply a convenient data structure. The actual value are the UTXOs that are attested to by the blocks of transactions in that blockchain. The fact that those transactions happen to be presented, structured in a data structure that is called a blockchain is essentially accidental. The important fact is the existence and the proof of validity of the UTXOs, not the fact of the chain, which is simply a structure in which to present the block of transactions. And any of a number of other reasonable data structures can be substituted for it, as indeed in my own work, I substitute a directed acyclic graph rather than a blockchain or linked list as the basis for the data structure. The important thing is the UTXOs. That's where the reified value of Bitcoin is. Okay, now the contentious question that people raise, what backs Bitcoin? The answer is the same thing that backs an unrecorded deed. It is the consent and the acceptance by users, by parties or potential parties to a transaction. Recording the deed is not, in the end, in most jurisdictions, even in common law, this is getting cloudy because of the creeping influence of Napoleonic and Roman legal thinking. But the recording is not the authoritative provenance. The deed and the instruments which modify that deed constitute as a change the authoritative provenance. Where do those instruments derive their authority? They derive it from the consent and acceptance by users, and that consent and that acceptance is itself conclusively demonstrated by the fact of these instruments being affixed in a chain of provenance to make up the deed as modified. We can ask, what backs any rule or principle? And the answer is always either consent or violence. If a rule derives its authority from being accepted by the consent of those who will live under that rule or by that principle, that is the world we see with Bitcoin. That is the world we see with the acceptance of the unrecorded deed. That is indeed the world we see within genomics, where the fact that a receptor cell will agree to the acceptance, the validation, if you will, of a particular protein is consent. Otherwise, we have to depend on violence. We have to depend on the coercive effect of governance. Now, I will simply throw out here that which enjoys consent is superior to that which is enforced. The world is divided into those who take one position and those who take the other. But I'm firmly in the camp of consent, and I'm firmly opposed to enforcement, particularly enforcement against consent. And I hope I'm making it clear that it is this choice which Satoshi makes, which is the basis of the value of Bitcoin. To use a different meme, if you will, that I occasionally use in these talks, what we're talking about is regulation versus governance. And this is a distinction which has been lost, but in the 18th century, this was a well-known trope which was common and could be relied on to be known by any reasonably educated person. In the Second Amendment to the US Constitution, when we see the phrase, a well-regulated militia, that trope, that metaphor is drawn from clockmaking. In the 18th century, clocks had finally been made accurate enough to allow the measurement of longitude, which requires an accurate measure of time. And the creation of sufficiently accurate clocks allowed the blue water navigation, which allowed the explosion of commerce that characterizes the 18th century. The metaphor was drawn from clockmaking. In a clock, there is a piece called the regulator. It is a half moon shaped piece of usually metal, which, if it is cut accurately, moves exactly far enough from side to side in the escapement mechanism that each tick and tock is exactly 1 second. If you have a well-regulated clock, the internal regulator is sufficiently accurate that it can be relied on to keep constant and reliable time. If your regulator is in any way off, missized, mismatched with the escapement mechanism, then there is another piece of equipment which can be added to a clock, which is called a governor, which instead of internal regulation, imposes external governance. You may have seen these on clocks, often as a little screw marked plus and minus, which allows you to slow down or speed up the clock. The internal tick-tock is dictated by internal regulation, by the regulator. The regulator may or may not achieve the accuracy that you're looking for. If, as a user of that clock, you feel that there needs to be outside governance of the internal regulation, you do it with the governor. And that distinction is woven into essentially all of Enlightenment political thought, and most particularly in constitutional political and legal thought at the beginning of the United States. So it's worth bearing in mind the utter distinction between regulation and governance, internal accuracy as opposed to external control. All right, have at me.
Questions or comments? Should be able to unmute yourselves. Yes, Joffre.
First of all, thank you for the brilliant, comprehensive lecture, and I agree totally with the assessment of what blockchain and Bitcoin are. Now, going back to your last slide, can you give us a difference between regulation, governance, and government in the case of Bitcoin and blockchain and the other cryptocurrencies? Thank you.
Well, let's not talk about cryptocurrencies. Let's particularly don't talk about other cryptocurrencies. Bitcoin is not really a currency. Bitcoin is sui generis, and it is nothing like those things which call themselves cryptocurrencies, and most especially nothing like those things which are derived from the Ethereum blockchain and so-called distributed ledger technology, which are abstractions of value rather than reifications of value. Bitcoin's value is its provable internal regulation.
Yes. Now, is there governance involved in Bitcoin?
No, that's the point. That
Okay.
everything has been disintermediated except the three entities which cannot be disintermediated: the transferor, the receiver, and the asset itself.
Okay. Can I give kind of? I've been doing a lot of reflection myself, and in human relations, which is really at the core of market transactions as well, is empathy. In a way, empathy is currency, and when currency is used in a transaction, it should lead, if it's based on empathy, it's based on sovereignty. The more you use a currency between two empathic individuals, both their sovereignty or self-determination increases. If it's not based on empathy, but more on power over the other, and it can be through debt, then no sovereignty is possible because it will always end up with one party having more benefits over the other. Would you agree with that reflection? And is it relevant to the use of Bitcoin and other blockchains?
Yes, this is exactly the point I'm trying to make against about the difference between consent and enforcement, the difference between acceptance and violence. that
Uh-huh.
if you can find a way to reify empathy, you'll not only deserve a Nobel Prize, you'll probably deserve apotheosis of some sort. But what we're looking at here is a demonstrable reification of value and the transfer of value as an economic matter. That's what Satoshi accomplished. Whether the reification of empathy and the transfer of that reified form could somehow be accomplished, and what it would look like and what kind of mechanism would transfer it, I haven't a clue. Theoretically, by analogy with the processes we've discussed, you might well think that in human-to-human relations, it is necessary to reify empathy, lest there be a misunderstanding between the parties of the value of what is given versus the value of what is received. And I would encourage you to think about how that might be done. But what we're talking about here is the first reification of value that has been not just undertaken, but put out in working software for more than 250 years.
Right. And my last question is, given that I would tend to look at the governance in blockchain transactions as, if there's governance involved, it should be fair, accountable, and transparent. What seems to be the value in such transactions is another feature that may not be included